I'd like to make a couple connections from what we were doing last night to what we're doing this morning, if we could, in our first section on the house of God. And so I'd like to say something about worship more generally considered, and then reiterate a couple points made last night. Regarding worship more generally considered, I've discovered in my studies through the years that there really are, largely speaking, three broad approaches to what we call worship in the Christian tradition, especially here in the United States. And we can designate them all beginning with an R, which may help the memory work. There is Roman worship, there is Reformational worship, and there is Revivalist worship. Roman worship, of course, is the worship of the church in Rome under the authority of the Holy See in Rome. Reformational worship is worship that follows the principle of sola scriptura and seeks biblical authority for what it does. Revivalist worship is worship that is designed to attract unbelievers to the gospel and to persuade them to believe it. And these three broad traditions actually sort of have different criteria for how they measure worship. Roman worship must correspond to the teaching authority in Rome. And before Vatican II, it had a slightly different set of standards, and since 1963, a slightly different set after John the 23rd's work. Reformational worship has as its criterion the teaching of Holy Scripture, and Revivalist worship has evangelistic effectiveness. But what I've also come to recognize is that two of the three share a common understanding of what worship essentially is, and the third doesn't share that. So oddly enough, though you and I think of revivalist and reformational as being similar, and what the term we use, evangelical, comprehends both of them, actually when it comes to worship, both Catholicism and Protestantism conceive worship as a meeting with God. And revivalism conceives it more as a meeting between believers and unbelievers, where the one category tries to induce the other category to become like them. So oddly enough, on that one score, we have greater hope of rapprochement, as it were, between generally Reformational Christians and Roman Christians than we do between Reformational Christians and Revivalist Christians. Because it's one thing to have a different criterion by which we solve a problem, it's another thing to have a different problem altogether that we're addressing. And so at least within Catholicism, they believe that through the Mass they meet with the triune God who makes himself known this way. And in that sense, their conception is very similar to ours, even though their criterion, papal authority, is different than our criterion of scriptural authority. But they share with us this conception that that's what's happening, that we actually meet God insofar as he can be met in that particular place. And so I just mention that as you wrestle with the questions of worship, the whole ox cart gets unsettled depending upon the questions you raise of it. And so at least we have a shared hope in much of Western Christendom that what's actually happening is we're meeting God. O Lord, how shall I meet thee? How welcome thee aright? Or as Calvin, I greet thee, who my sure Redeemer art. A dialogue between God speaking to us in word and sacrament and our responding to him in prayer and praise is a very different understanding than to conceive the meeting as essentially a meeting between humans, some of whom urge the other humans to come to faith in God. That's a very different thing than when you have a meeting between sinners who are reconciled in God himself. And then I'd like to also reiterate, if you could, the first handout from last night to help it shape also what we're doing for the rest of the time. If you didn't receive this first handout with the three triads, it's in landscape mode rather than this way, it's this way. And at the top it has 5 different sets of triads that I suggest are essentially referentially the same thing as they look at the great narrative of creation, fall, redemption. They're all looking at the same thing, but we can designate those moments differently. And my suggestion is that the second, third, and fourth triads are especially germane to what we call worship. That creation, fall, redemption is not quite so directly that way, nor is the notion of primitive integrity, depravity, and recovery quite so. But when we're discussing worship, it is the presence of God in creation, the banishment from God's presence in what we call the fall, and then the restoration of fellowship between God and his image that is the great biblical narrative that we suggest appears by way of pageantry in what we call Christian worship. It is a pageant in which the once banished children of Adam are now readmitted by God's authority into His presence again in some way, anticipating the heavenly reversal of that reality. And the humans, once united in the beautiful integrity that Milton demonstrates in Paradise Lost, are scattered by their sin, not only alienated from God, but from one another. And then what happens in redemption is those who are far off come near, or as Ephesians 2 says, God has made alive both you, Gentiles, when you were dead in trespasses and sins, and we Jews, us Jews, when we were dead in trespasses and sins, and made the two one. He reconciles scattered parts of humanity into one as they come back into His presence to worship. And then also we can think very well that what happens is the humans are created to bask in the rule of God, and then we arise in insurrection against God and assert our members as rebellious weapons against His rule. And then God, in what we call redemption, restores His good rule over us. And that's where I think the Protestant or reformational principle of worship is so significant, because we attempt to do in worship what we find authority from Holy Scripture to do. The very effort to do it is an attempt to submit to God's rule. And so in His house, especially when we gather as His people, we wish to eschew all of those big ideas and good ideas and clever ideas that we have and hold those for other occasions. At a barbecue in the backyard, an anniversary, a birthday, whatever. But in our gathering together, we insist upon submitting our activity to the revealed will of God. And so whether we call it the regulative principle, or as I prefer, the royal principle, the point is we are allowing God at least once a week to rule. And so we find what that He wants His people to do, and we do the best we can to do it. We don't poll people first and say, what do you like and what do you like? That isn't the issue. At least once, right? As something that sort of gets the compass going in the right direction for the rest of the week, we begin the week by submitting to the will and reign of God. And so in our public assemblies we ask, what do the Scriptures teach us to do in these things together? And that is a corporate act of bowing the knee to the reign of God that we hope spills over throughout much of the rest of the week, where we continue to try to submit our unruly wills and affections to the perfect rule of God. And that's how worship would contribute to that. So just wanted to remind you that in some sense, that's what I want to bring us back to again and again this weekend. There are 5 legitimate biblical ways of looking at the great narrative of creation, fall, redemption. There isn't just one way. There's 5 different ways of looking at those 3 moments, 3 of which, in my judgment, are fairly germane to the issue of worship. As we turn our attention to this morning, the first section on the house of God, we're turning to this peculiar thing because what we find is not what we would have expected to find. When we say the house of God, from the time I was young to the time that I'm not young, what appears to my English-speaking mind is some architectural artifact. When I say house, I think of something that has foundations and walls, ceilings, doors and windows and so forth. That's what I think of when I think of a house. I can't just eradicate all of my English use of language. It's in there. I don't have the Keanu Reeves chip. I can't just undo what's there. And yet we find, as we look at a biblical theology of this expression, house of God, as we walk through and say, how does that expression appear through the various moments in the great narrative from Genesis to Revelation, we find that there's only 1 or 2 places where it's actually what you and I might call a house. It's almost never architecturally a house. And so that makes us, we have to sort of step back again. And we feel like Buckner. Here comes the ground ball right down the first base line. It goes right between our legs, right? So there it passes on. Jeff's very happy because he's a Yankees fan. In that case, a Mets fan, close enough. But it's almost too hard for us to handle this. And so what I would like to do in our first session is walk through the biblical uses of that expression. Not every last one of them. Don't panic. All right? but just the different uses of it to designate different things as we move through the biblical narrative. So that maybe by the end of our conversation, we're more comfortable with hearing something in some sense non-architectural when we hear the expression. And say, what is it then that we hear when we hear that expression? So the first use of it, as you know, is in Genesis 28, where the expression appears twice, when Jacob has his dream and his vision. And so the now banished human race, removed from the garden, suffering all sorts of heartache and hardship. Cain kills his brother Abel and so forth. Lamech is vengeful. It's a terrible world, awful things happening and so forth. And yet there is still some sort of residual memory passed on through the generations of things were once better. We lived in the presence of God, and it was blessed. When we were in God's presence, everything was wonderful. The tuning pitch was a perfect 440. Everything was just exactly right. And now almost nothing's right. But wouldn't it be wonderful to return to that place and to that person, the triune God, whose blessedness sanctified it? And so, after seeing the vision of a ladder that restores relations to heaven to earth, and it could have been a tower, it could have been a number of other things, the term is not entirely clear, Jacob is frightened. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. Now just stop right there for a moment and think about that. He's out asleep, he's out in the woods, or the field, got his head on a rock. Then he finds another use for it. There he is outside under the stars, we old backpackers would say. And he has a dream. And when he arises from the dream, this is the house of God. A strange thing to say. There's no house anywhere. He doesn't have a pup tent. There's no Winnebago. Nothing. Right? No Taj Mahal. This is the house of God, he says. Right? And this is the gate of heaven. No longer cherubim with swords, but a gate opening to heaven. Right? To the blessed realms. Now there's a gate. Something opening up. So he takes the stone, he sets it up, and calls the name of the place Beit El, house of God. He calls the place Bethel. But the name of the city was Luz at the first. So now they've got a place called Luz that's now called Beit El in Hebrew, Bethel. They rename it because of this curious event. It's called now House of God, Bethel. And so Jacob made a vow, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I go, will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. Then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. Now he calls the stone God's house. So he awakens from the dream and says, this is God's house. And then, this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. Well, it's an awfully small deity if he can fit in a rock. All right? It's a strange thing to call the rock, the stone, God's house. And again, Bet Elohim. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. So actually what happens is the text used the expression Beit Elohim twice, both up in the first place when he says this is none other than the house of God, and at the end shall be God's house. But then twice in the naming of the town, Beit El, it's just an abbreviated form of saying Beit Elohim. And so 4 times, and for the first time in Holy Scripture, there is this reference of a house for El or Elohim. And it happens right here. But it's not an architectural place. The only thing material about it is a rock. So there's a dream, a semi-conscious activity. There's a curious dream at that, angels going up and down on something, right? And this is the house of God. So the reason Genesis 28 to me is significant is the first use of anything in Scripture does in some sense dictate what comes afterwards. It's like the opening measures of a symphony. If the writer of the symphony writes it in a particular time signature and key signature, that's going to dictate the rest of what he can do. And the opening measures especially will dictate what we expect of that, at least that movement, if not the entire symphony. And so biblically, the first time we have the expression Beit El or Beit Elohim, it is not a piece of architecture. In fact, it's a very curious event altogether. And yet, that's called the house of God. It's the Jungian prototype, as it were. This is what house of God means. And so what house of God means is this little glimpse of those of us down in the banished realm, imagining that there might be travel between heaven and earth again. That we might get back to where the angels now dwell. And so to see that is to see the house of God. So the house of God, curiously enough, is not merely a place for the deity to dwell, but for the children of Adam to dwell with the deity. It's called God's house because He's the one that sanctifies it by His presence. It's His glory that makes it glorious, of course. But it's not just God in se. It's God visited by angels. And Jacob hoping to be one that makes it house of God. So house of God, from its first usage in Genesis 28, is A, not a piece of architecture, and B, a symbol of communion between the once banished human and the God who made him. That's what house of God means. And it takes a long time to get over the notion that it's a piece of architecture. A fixed, permanent piece. Well, there's nothing permanent in Kansas because when the wind blows out here, nothing's permanent. But in other portions, like on the East Coast, we've got old buildings in New Hampshire that have been there since the 17th century, right? Here they last about 5 minutes when the tornadoes come through. But we normally tend to think of at least a semi-permanent thing when we say house. And we use other language for less permanent things. Winnebago, RV, tent, right? But house, to us, denotes something permanent, and it plainly wasn't. And then the next use of the term house of God is for the tabernacle, instituted in Numbers and Leviticus through the law of Moses. Later it will be the first and second temples, but initially the tabernacle is also a place to meet Yahweh. And note a couple things about this, that now the tabernacle is expressly instituted by God. Jacob just saw it as a dream. There was no command, you shall have a dream, and it shall look like this. Right? He's just there, and he's dreaming. Semi-awake, semi-asleep. And he sees this thing. And we might have thought, well, that's just a blip on the screen. Right? Curious, but that's all. Curiouser and curiouser, cried Alice, we might say. And just let the whole matter go. But now, the tabernacle is instituted by Mosaic law. Meaning now that we not merely have kind of a vague memory of one of the patriarchs with a curious event in Luz. Now, it's instituted in Israel as a permanent feature of her life that there shall be this enormous tent, about the size of this, maybe a shade larger, called the house of God. We call it the tabernacle. A tent that is in some sense now instituted to be visited and for certain things to be done in it. So now it's no longer just a curious accident or a happenstance. Now it is instituted as a regular part of the life of God's people, that they have a place that's called the house of God. And so just a few texts to remind you of this. Judges 18:31. So they set up Micah's carved image that he had made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. The house of God, the tabernacle is called there. And their brothers, 1 Chronicles 6, and their brothers, the Levites, were appointed for all the service of the tabernacle of the house of God. The tabernacle called the house of God there. 1 Chronicles 9. Mariot, son of Ahitub, the chief officer of the house of God. So this tabernacle that they were instructed to build is called a house of God. And again, it's not a permanent structure. When it says it was once at Shiloh, this was like a tent. And you could pick it up and take it to another place. My old Timberland 2 by Eureka is still being used today. The students bought it last week on one of their hikes on the long weekend. I bought it in the mid-1970s. It was the highest tech tent available in the mid-1970s. It cost about $170. Now you can get it about $119 because it's the lowest tech thing available. It's the same exact design, and it's actually much cheaper and probably even more cheap in real dollars, because think of the inflation of the difference between the 70s. But it's still working, and it still functions pretty well. And it sleeps 2 normal humans, 3 Gordons. Well, or a whole family reunion of Gordons, but we can certainly fit easily 3 Gordons in it and 2 other-sized peoples. And if we were to say, where has that been? Well, I used to hike with it in the Southwest Virginia when I was in college, Dragon's Tooth and McAfee Knob and Tinker Cliffs and so forth. Then to New England, it's been up on Lake Winnipesaukee and Lake Ossipee and so forth, and it's been at the foot of Mount Lafayette and several other places. It's been up into northeastern Vermont. It's been around a lot of places, right? It's the House of Gordon, but it has no permanent address, right? On the run, on the lam from the IRS, perhaps I am, right? And so I've got something that moves. Well, so also the tabernacle, while called the house of God, does not permanently reside in any permanent location. It moves all around. And so there goes the tabernacle. And the Israelites, as they moved, they took the tabernacle with them. It is the house of God. It's called the house of God. It is not a permanent piece of architecture. And that's very, very significant, isn't it? Because if it's not just a place for the deity to dwell, because heaven is His throne and earth is His footstool, what is the house you would make for me? If it's not just a place for the deity to dwell, but for us to meet the deity, you see, then when Israel moves increasingly into Canaan, her tabernacle has to move also so that she can retain her meetings with God. And so as she moves towards the land of Canaan, her tabernacle, the house of God, goes with her. And when she moves throughout Canaan, the tabernacle, the house of God, moves with her, because it is not merely the house for God, it's the house where we meet God. And therefore, He institutes it to remind us of the necessity and great blessedness that would happen to the human race if we could re-enter His presence. And so it moves. It's not a permanent piece of architecture. And of course, what's the primary feature of what is done there, right, in the tabernacle? And the answer is sacrifice. So now that God institutes a permanent place to meet with Him, there is this reminder, not only because of the cherubim and their flaming swords, not only because of that, but because of the insistence on sacrifice, that for us to meet with God, His wrath has to be unkindled. His anger as a holy being against an unholy one has to be satisfied and quenched. And so, even in this permanently instituted, though moving reality, what has to be done there is priests must offer sacrifices, lest we think that we as the unholy can waltz back into the presence of a holy God until His wrath is propitiated. And so the building moves with us as a tent to remind us of our need and hope to be reunited to God. And the consistent bleating of dying animals reminds us of the awful cost of reconciling unholy people to a holy God. And so every now and then we see models of the tabernacle. Religious people sometimes have theme camps and these kinds of things. Some people reconstruct Noah's Ark and some reconstruct the tabernacle and so forth. And I think you can find the temple at several of these kinds of places. And what I routinely suggest is, well, you know, the Ark isn't the Ark if you're watching it with dry skin. All right? If you're not threatened with drowning, the Ark isn't the Ark. And the tabernacle without the bleating of goats is not the tabernacle. These were not quick kills like they do with their stun guns in our slaughterhouses today, but even in our slaughterhouses today, the quick kills are not always equally quick. And you hear the lowing of a cow, right? The bleating of another animal, as the kill was not as quick as we might have thought. And think of that if you're taking children with you to the tabernacle and later the temple. Oh, look at the cute little lamb, Mom. Well, oh my goodness, Billy's not going to like this. Right, right, right. And so then the little lamb, well, Mommy, that's horrible. Why was that necessary? Well, Billy, it's either your blood or the lamb's blood. It's either Mommy's blood or the lamb's blood. It's either Uncle George's blood or the lamb's blood. To meet our God, our sin has to be dealt with. And it is horrible. Our sin is horrible. And the penalty for it is no more horrible than the sin itself. The sin is just as bad. And the penalty is just the due result and wages of the sin. And someone's going to have to pay if we are to enjoy the presence of God again. And so generation after generation, this takes place in the house of God, where sinners have the hope of being reconciled to their holy God but are constantly reminded that this is going to be a costly, costly thing. Because all of those animals sacrificed again and again for all those years, as the author of Hebrews says, did not take away sin, or they would have stopped. If one of those bulls would have done it, they would have stopped. But after the crucifixion of Christ, there are no more sacrifices, because that one death did stop the wrath of God. None of the other ones did. They were a picture of what might stop the wrath of God, but they didn't stop it, because we had to do it again. It's like a mortgage payment. You just keep, oh, do we own the house now? No, we got 30 more years of this. Right? It just keeps going. It's the gift that keeps on taking. You keep paying that mortgage, and it doesn't belong to you until after 30 years, because it's the bank's until then. And Israel's sacrifices, by their very repetition, said, these point to the costly nature of atonement, but they do not affect it. They are pictures of it, but they do not affect it. And so in that house of God, that's what takes place. There's a picture of meeting with God and a picture of the great cost that meeting with God is going to take. And so in the temple also, I could bore you if I wished with 50 or 60 or 70 references to both the first and the second temple being referred to by the same language as the tabernacle, the house of God. I won't, because you've read so many of those texts, you understand that eventually, once there's a monarchy, which was a mistake, read 1 Samuel 8, it was a mistake to wish to have a king like the other nations around us. But at any rate, that's what they insisted on, and that's what they got. And then once they did, of course, the king will normally settle somewhere and set up his accoutrement and his administration and everything else. That's what kings do. And so once you have Saul and then David and Solomon and so forth, there's this desire to build a permanent place. Now that the Israelites are not moving throughout Canaan, but have found a place to settle, we don't need to have a tent anymore. Now we can have another dwelling and meet God there. And so now David is a violent and adulterous person, doesn't have the opportunity to build it. Solomon, who's nearly as bad, many times worse, eventually does build it. And so we end up with a permanent thing, not a tent, in Jerusalem until it's destroyed. And then after the exile, they come back and build a second one, which is a little less impressive than the first one. But in both the first and the second temples, they are referred to as house of God. And so having a dream can be called the house of God. A tent can be called the house of God that moves. A permanent piece of architecture can also be called the house of God, and that's what we think of when we think of a house. But any of those can be and is called the house of God. And so what's permanent to all three is the place where we meet God. The actual form of it, a rock under the head, a tent, a building, these are all very formally different, but for their substance and what they invoke and teach, they're all the same thing. A place where once banished humans can have a picture and a hope, therefore, of meeting God again. That's what they all have in common. And so there are other places, I think there are 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 places in the Old Testament where it's unclear which of those it's referring to. Some of the Psalms are not datable sufficiently clear that we can know which of the ones. These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise. If it's an older one, it's a reference to the tabernacle. If it were a later one, it's probably a reference to the more permanent temple in Jerusalem. We just don't know because the dating of those is difficult. We do know that Psalm 90 goes back to Moses, a man of God. And so some of the Psalms are very old for their original substance. So some may be referring to the tabernacle and some are referring to the permanent temple. And then if we had some that were late enough, they might be the second temple after the return from captivity in Babylon when they rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah. But then let me show you a few places in the Old Testament where tent, the language of tent, and the language of assembling appear together. Because these remind us that the tent is not just a habitation for the deity, but a place where the people assemble with the deity. There are a number of those places where the tabernacle or tent appears in passages where the language of assembling also appears. Leviticus 8:3, assemble all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him, and the congregation was assembled at the entrance of the tent of meeting. It's synagogein that's translated congregation here, and it was assembled, the ordinary language of ecclesia in its verbal form, and they assemble at the entrance, the door of the tent of meeting. The tent there is now a place where the people assemble. So it's not just God's house where He alone is, it's a place where they assemble. In Numbers 3, referring to the Levites, they shall guard over him, Aaron, and over the whole congregation before the tent of the meeting. Isn't that interesting, guarding both? As they minister at the tabernacle. They shall guard all the furnishings of the tent of meeting and keep guard over the people of Israel as they minister at the tabernacle. And you shall give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are wholly given to him from among the people of Israel. And you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall guard their priesthood. But if any outsider comes near, he shall be put to death. Now note, they guard the furnishings of the tent of meeting, the laver that they wash in and so forth, probably the Ark of the Covenant and other things, and the candles and the lampstands and so forth. But they guard also the people of Israel. Isn't that interesting? In their priestly duty, they guard the stuff inside the tabernacle, and they guard the people, because the people assemble there. It's not just a place where Yahweh is. It's also a place where the once banished people of God are, and the Levites guard, protect, and preserve both the stuff that's inside of it and the people who gather at its entrance and never go through. The 11 tribes that can't get past that entrance, they guard them also and preserve them. And so there are a number of passages like this where the language of the congregation assembling at the tent reminds us that the house of God is always, in some sense, this, if we could say it in English. The house of God, hyphen, and hyphen, His hyphen once, hyphen banished, hyphen people. Right? Because it is spoken of so frequently as the place where they assembled. It's there again and again. The tent or the house is the place not merely where God is, off on His own island somewhere. It's the place where His people assemble to meet with Him. That's where the matter is the case. The same is true of the language of house, bait, and the language of assembly. Sometimes the tent is not referred to as tent, but as to house. And there are many places where the language of house also appears with the language of assembly. In 1 Chronicles 28, David rose to his feet. "Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God, and I made preparations for building." But where it says David rose to his feet, the Greek translation of the Old Testament says he rose to his feet in the midst of the assembly and said, "Hear me, my brothers." Now that's implicit when it says, "Hear me, my brothers," that the people are there also. And that was so much the case that the translators of the Hebrew into Greek said, "He rose in the midst of the assembly and said," because it's to the people and in their midst that he says these words about the house. In 2 Chronicles 20, verse 5, Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord. In the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord. That assembly is now even described by apposition as the house of the Lord. 2 Chronicles 23, all the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of God. They all made covenant in the house of God. The assembly of the people is associated with the house of God. Out of deference and respect, they don't call it the house of God hyphen and His people. They call it the house of God. But it is a house wherein not only God dwells, but a house wherein God meets His once banished people. And so they can mention the assembly that way. Now you and I know that the apostles did not feel it any obligation to hold the Christian assemblies in the temple in Jerusalem. And had they tried, I don't think the Sanhedrin would have let them get away with it. Right? And so we know that the apostles, to the best of our knowledge, never met on the first day of the week in the temple at Jerusalem. And so we would just assume that the expression house of God disappears from the New Testament canon. because that's where the Jews met. And the Christians are meeting wherever they happen to meet. Catacombs, wealthy people's houses, so forth, meeting all over the place. But curiously, the New Testament, even after the Gospels, after the ministry of Christ, after the death and resurrection, still use the expression house of God from time to time. It's not done away with, nor is it only used to describe the place where he used to meet with his people. So consider a few of these. 1 Timothy 3, we mentioned briefly yesterday. I write this in order that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the house of God. As though there is still a behavior in the house of God, and that Timothy, as a New Testament minister, needs to know how one ought to behave in the house of God. And then he says more. Which house? Which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. So the whole thing together. That you, Timothy, may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church assembly of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. There still is a house of God, and we need to know how to behave in it. And Timothy as a minister will have to instruct people in how to behave in the house of God, but he now defines the house of God as the church, which is the church of the living God. That's the house of God now. Once a rock, then a tent, then an architectural building, and now a gathering of those who celebrate the resurrection of Christ on the first day of the week. Strange metamorphosis that goes through this use of house of God. And yet, what's common to them all? A vision of the once banished human welcomed back into the presence of the Holy God. It's true in every case. It's still the house of God. Because it's still the place, not merely where God dwells, but where He meets those who will return to Him on His terms. And if they're willing to return to Him on His terms, we call that the house of God. It's not merely where He lives. And then Hebrews 3 and Hebrews 10 do this, of course, also. Referring to Christ, the author said that He was faithful to Him who appointed Him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory, as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are His house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in hope. Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself, implying that Jesus, in verses 3 and 4, is the builder of the house and worthy of more honor. And we are His house. So now again, the house of God is not a rock, it's not a tent, it's not a piece of architecture, it's us, and Jesus built us. Right? So Solomon got to build the permanent house. The Levitical Levites and priests put together the first tabernacles, the tent. Jacob woke up with a rock under his head. Right? And Jesus has built this new house. He is its builder, and we are His house. We are where God is to be met in this moment, in the narrative that begins in Genesis and ends in Revelation 22. And at different moments, it was a different place. It could be a rock, a tent, a building. It's now the assembly of saints on the first day of the week following apostolic instruction. Or in Hebrews 10:19, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that He opened for us through the curtain, that is, through His flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. And so to what do the New Testament saints draw near? They draw near on the first day of the week to their assemblies. That's where we draw near. We gather there. In fact, just a few verses later, and do not forsake the assemblings of one another, as he continues his thought, because that's what he's talking about. And so we have a great priest over the house of God, the risen Christ, and that's what he does. He rules his assembly. And we aren't to forsake those assemblies, because that is now God's house. And if we have any zeal for God's house, then that's a very important thing. In 1 Peter 2, as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves like living stones. You yourselves like living stones are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Christ. Now, it doesn't use house of God there, but it does talk about stones, the kind of things they used to build architectural buildings in the ancient world. And so just as Psalm 118, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, using architectural language of the relation between the house building and the stones out of which it's built. Peter uses this and talks of Christ as a stone, probably thinking about Psalm 118, I suspect, but then even refers to the believers as living stones, a deliberate irony, if not an oxymoron. Stones don't live. And so when he refers to us as living stones, why does he mean that? Because the current building, the place that is now God's house, the place where God can be met, is with these living saints who on the first day of the week assemble together to give adoration and praise to God through His resurrected Son. And so they are also living stones. He's building a building out of living stones rather than dead stones. Are they a little unruly from time to time? Oh yes, ask any deacon or elder. But they are living. And they have mouths that sing praise. And the stones can't. It's only figuratively that the Scriptures say, but if you don't, the stones will cry out. The stones really won't. They don't have a larynx. And so the imperfect sheep that make up the living stones of Christ's house, for all their imperfections, still with all their imperfect faith and stammering tongue, do sing praise to God. And so they are part of His house for all of their imperfections and flaws. And so they are built up into the spiritual house, a place where God now dwells through the risen Christ. So we are also, in that sense, the house of God. So these are the traits of the house of God. If we look at the narrative from Jacob on through the New Testament writings into the book of Revelation, we find that among these, or especially these traits are there. They are all divinely instituted. Even Jacob's dream was given to him by God. He didn't get it anywhere else. He didn't go to dreamworks.com and ask for a dream. God gave him this dream, and he was flabbergasted by it. It was God who came into this one Spanish order and says, you can't live without hope, human. You have to have a glimpse that beyond this life and all its curses and woes, you will be restored to your Maker. And so I'm going to give it to Jacob, and I hope he'll be good enough to pass it on to some others. But it's still divinely instituted. The hope for reconciliation of a once banished people does not reside Tower of Babel in us, storming heaven and recreating a way to get there. The hope resides that God Himself will extend the palm of peace, and by His own institution invite us in. And of course, in Leviticus, the remarkable detailed instructions for the building of the tabernacle. Completely divinely instituted. Here's how you're going to do it. He didn't say go out and ask the Israelites what color they like the curtains, right? Or bring in someone to consult from the outside. Here's what it's going to be like. A second trait of this is that the holiness of it is more or less implicit or explicit in different portions of that narrative. When you have the tabernacle, the place that the Levites go into is called the holy place, and the place where the high priest goes once annually is called the holiest place, or the Holy of Holies. It's supremely holy. And all of this reminds us that the holiness of God, contrasted to our unholiness that led to the banishment in the first place, He is still holy. And His holiness has to be regarded as such. And so even when we have a picture of entering His presence, it's not because He has dropped His standards and He is unholy like us, and therefore we all get along. But rather, He remains holy. His holiness is what sanctifies the house, and He provides a means of the unholy to nonetheless come back into His presence. And that's why sacrifices, as a third principle, are such an important feature of house of God. God institutes this hopeful thing, reminds us of His holiness and our unholiness that caused the original banishment and separation, and then institutes sacrifice because only an appeased deity can now allow the unholy in. And so sacrifice is the primary activity that takes place in tabernacle and temple. And you say, well, what about singing of praise? Didn't they sing of praise? Yeah, there is some singing of praise. But remember, the Levites are out there working pretty much around the clock, even when the other tribes are not there on the outskirts thereof. And so there's an enormous amount of sacrificing going on. That's the regular activity that's taking place there. And even in the John 2 that we looked at last night, the reason you had money changers is because when people traveled to Jerusalem to offer the sacrifices, it was easier to bring a little money with them than to drag 2 oxen or whatever it was they were supposed to sacrifice. Then they would get there and they would exchange the money to whatever the currency was there and buy an ox or a goat or a pigeon or whatever they needed to sacrifice and take it in there. But it was still, even that's sacrificial. That's why they were exchanging. They weren't just trying to beat the exchange rate. Well, the yen's low today, so let's... It wasn't one of those things. Even that had to do with sacrifice. And that's why in all of the worship which the church offers, we do so expressly and explicitly through the mediation of Christ. The catechisms even say this, both the larger and the shorter, what is prayer? And then it gives their respective answers and always mentions through the mediation of Christ. And that's because sinners don't dare go unmediated into the presence of a holy God. And so even our pious habit of, say, through the name of your blessed Son Jesus or whatever we do, we always recognize that we do not go to God in ourselves. We do not go just as I am. We go just as I am in Christ, right, and via His mediation. And so it is just as I am through the reconciling and mediation of Christ that we enter the presence of God, because He is still holy and we are yet unholy in many ways. We are treasured by Him through Christ and by union with Him as being part of His holy bride, but we don't look as holy as we're going to in the next life, right? We are still going to have some work done in the transformation that we call glorification. So even now, though we are already united to Him, as an act of piety, we address God through the Son. It's the routine way that we include Christian prayers, or some of them just expressly include Him in the process, in which case it need not be invoked at the tail end. It's just we recognize that our access to God is because He's the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And as such, we are reconciled to Him because of the perfectly obedient work of His Son. So as we wrestle with house of God, it seems to me we have a negative task and a positive task. Negatively, we have to disabuse ourselves that the notion house of God is fundamentally architectural. Because the other ways, a stone on the ground, a tent, a group of people who meet on the first day of the week, are manifestly not. And so we have to kind of try to erase the notion that house of God means a building somewhere. And then positively say, no, what it is a house where the God who once banished humans permits them to get a glimpse of meeting with Him again. And therefore it is a house that reminds us of His yet holiness and our yet unholiness, and therefore is constantly aware of sacrificial mediation. And so do this in remembrance of me reminds us, right, that the body of Christ is given for us and the blood of Christ is shed for us, so that we are reminded that our access to God and union and communion with Him comes through the sacrificial mediation of the Christ who dies for sinners. That's the truth. These are the truths that are always available. The form that house of God takes can change from a rock to a tent to a building to a group of assembled humans. The reality is that it's a divinely instituted meeting place between God and His yet unholy people, which therefore necessitates a sacrifice to work. Those are the things that are unchanging. The formal matters are changing. But we are living stones. He's building a living building. This is where God now meets people on earth and promises them with a better meeting with a capital M yet to come. It is in this living thing the assembly of yet imperfect saints who, through the mediation of Christ and through His dying and rising, are invited back to the presence of God. And that's why hymns that have as their first verse, "O Lord, how shall I meet Thee, how welcome Thee," are exactly right. Or Calvin's, "I greet Thee, who my sure Redeemer art." Many of the hymns are properly written in the second person and actually address the deity. "Holy, holy, holy, early in the morning my song shall rise to Thee." Right. Now, I'm not saying every song has to do that. Some of the biblical psalms don't. Some of them are third person, talking about God. That's fine. Many of them are second person, addresses to God. That's fine too. The particular advantage of the second person ones is they do remind us that we are not merely talking about a God, but we are on His terms, entering His presence again, and meeting with Him. That's why even in the Christian era, in many of our churches, we conclude with the old benediction that goes back to Aaron. Right? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord lift up His face upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and be gracious unto you, and so forth. We think of the very presence of God there, right? Who had turned away, as it were, turned us away. And now He lifts up His countenance upon us. It's a remarkable thing. We sometimes will include it at the end, a Trinitarian statement. I tend to prefer to do that, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, to make it clear that it's the mediation of Christ that affects what the Aaronic priests did. But we still use it because it's such a beautifully communion-like reality. As the God that once cursed, the Lord bless you. Right? The Lord that said, "Cursed is the ground because of you." Cursed is this. The Lord bless you and keep you. It's a remarkable reversal of the curse banishment, and a remarkable thing to say in the conclusion. And so when the minister says, "Receive the Lord's benediction or blessing," and the people rise to do so, yeah, we receive it. It's like Ed McMahon sending you $1 million from the lottery, right? It's just the greatest thing possible that the Lord now lifts up His countenance upon us through the mediation anticipated through the Aaronic priests, who were only types of the priesthood of Christ. And through that, now, the once banishing God is a welcoming and blessing God. The cursing God is now a blessing God. The banishing God is now a welcoming God. And I used to say, Jeff, don't know how you feel about it, and others here, Craig, that there are very few ministerial acts of a higher order of privilege than the benediction at the conclusion of a service. What greater privilege of all ministerial acts than that? It's nearly as great as holding the hand of someone dying in a hospital, where we get to represent the Christ who came not to be served but to serve. We always feel privileged when we have the opportunity to represent Him there. But the privilege liturgically of the benediction at the end of a service is really quite a high privilege, a remarkable kind of a thing, because the whole biblical narrative gets reversed in the last Adam, and the cursing, vanishing God becomes this blessing, welcoming God. And it's summed up so succinctly in any of those benedictory statements that it's just the most remarkable privilege to do. Fortunately, it's easy enough that a smart German shepherd could do it, so it requires no great skill. I'm not going to bother writing a book why Johnny can't do a benediction, because I think he probably could. But it requires very little skill, but it's the greatest moment in the liturgy, I think. It's just the greatest thing that happens. So let me pause and see if there are questions about House of God, especially the fact that it looks differently. The term can be used to describe some very different looking things, and yet there are still some consistent traits in each of those, and trying to say what's the part that can come or go, whether it's a rock or a tent or a permanent building or a group of people. That part moves. All of it pictures in its own way of the garden re-entered. But then there's some other things that are stable. It's instituted. It comes from God. It reminds of His holiness and our unholiness. That's consistent all the way through. And therefore sacrifice has a consistent place in it, because God's wrath has to be appeased. So those are the elements that are unchanging. The other elements change very, very profoundly. So it's a very different house than our houses. Different term to use than our houses, because ours, unless the wind blows here, our houses look pretty permanent and don't change that much. We wouldn't call a rock a house.